Greetings, Con 102 class, and welcome to the lecture on coordinated management of meaning. The theorists involved in this particular theory, W. Barnett Peirce, who you'll note there on the slide, is involved in Peirce Associates until 2010, and Vernon Cronin from the University of Massachusetts. He is an emeritus professor there. This is a difficult theory. It is, first of all, an interpretive theory. So we're definitely on the interpretive side of things in treating this theory. It's not an objective theory. They don't do experimental research to try to test particular propositions or explanations of phenomena. But one thing that you will notice in this theory is it is a value-driven theory. So Barnett Peirce, in particular, has been involved in a peace center. So he is bringing particular values to his communication theory stance and trying to work for peace. And that's one of the things that you'll notice about interpretive theories. They often articulate particular values. Those values can come from a variety of places, either a philosophical system, a set of personal values. They can come from ethical theory, theology, or whatever. And Barnett Peirce is definitely committed in his coordinated management of meaning theory to working for positive values of peace. And so that's very typical of interpretive theory. One of the major propositions in the coordinated management of meaning approach is that communication is much more than the exchange of ideas. You'll notice that one of the early definitions of communication was that communication is an exchange of messages where people are affected, and certainly the notion that people are affected is a very big part of the coordinated management of meaning approach, because the basic idea here is that it is through communication that our social worlds are created. Now, you'll notice the other day when we talked about the importance of conversation, and we had that quote from Diane Rehm, and the notion that our identities are formed in conversation. There is a similarity here in the CCM theory. Communication actually does form our identities, and it forms our social worlds through people being in conversation. Conversation in the coordinated management of theory, the coordinated management of meaning theory, is actually the primary social process in life. It is through conversation that people are bound together. Apart from the topic talked about, they are bound together in intricate ways. This bond of union lithograph by Escher sort of depicts this idea that it is through the communication process that our social world is created. And any action that we take in conversation reflects back upon us and helps to make us who we are. And so that idea is fundamental in this particular theory. We are about the business of coordinating meaning with other people through conversation. Now, I have a story to tell in this particular lecture. You'll notice that M. Griffin in the chapter uses an interaction with an old high school friend to illustrate how meaning is coordinated. And I actually have a similar story that I want to talk about that I think illustrates how meaning was coordinated in one particular case. One of the ideas in this theory is that the stories we tell are not necessarily the stories that we live. The stories that we tell in conversation may be different than the stories that we live. When we tell stories, we are actually involved in making and managing meaning. And it's not necessarily the case that those stories that we tell are the stories that we have lived. My story has to do with Facebook. And Doug can take a show of hands there. I'm wondering how many of you in the room today have actually connected with an old friend accidentally through Facebook. Just put your hand up so we can see How many people have actually had that experience where you went onto Facebook and you connected with someone who you had lost touch with for a long time? Well, my story today focuses around just that particular circumstance. Now, you'll notice here that I am pictured with a lot of donuts, and there are 24 Dunkin' Donuts sitting there, and the story revolves around that. When I was 11 years old, my father was an aeronautical engineer, and he got out of that career, and he opened up a Dunkin' Donut shop in central New Jersey, a little town called Highland Park, which is right by Rutgers University. And he moved the family there when I was 11, and I started working in the donut shop before I was 12 years old. I was paid $1 an hour. It was my first summer job. And I grew up there in New Jersey, and I had junior high school friends and high school friends. And one such friend that I made in high school was a guy named Harold. And Harold was a New York Yankees fan. Being from the New Jersey area, he liked the New York Knicks. He liked the New York Yankees. Well, I had come from Baltimore. My parents had moved us from Baltimore, and I was a Baltimore Orioles fan and a Baltimore Bullets fan back then, a franchise that no longer exists. But Harold and I would make sports wagers in high school. And I remember that I definitely would promise to pay off any sports bet that I lost in donuts. It was relatively easy for me to do that because my parents, owning a donut shop, I could just say, hey, I'll give you a donut if I lose this bet. And sometimes I actually said I'd give you more than a donut. I told him I would give him a dozen donuts. Well, Harold and I lost contact with each other, and several years ago, it was actually back in about 2012, we connected accidentally through the Facebook network. And Harold sent me a message. The first message that he sent me on Facebook was this message that you see here on the screen. I've been waiting for over 40 years for you to pay off your sports bets. You owe me 17 dozen donuts. That was the first message that I received from him. Well, as the Coordinated Management of Meaning theory states, the stories we tell differ from the stories we live. And Harold was telling a particular story that he had been waiting for over 40 years for me to pay off my sports bets, and he accused me of owing him 17 dozen donuts. And that was a little bit surprising to me, to say the least. I wasn't really sure when Harold told me that, what I thought of that. And I could have decided that that was a hostile comment. So we're making and managing meaning when we tell these stories, and I could have just decided to drop Harold right away as my Facebook friend, because this message really had a little bit potentially of a hostile tone in it. I could have said, what are you talking about? I don't owe you 17 dozen donuts. I'm not going to interact with you anymore on Facebook. So I could have dropped Harold as my Facebook friend, but I was reminded, actually, of what Pearce and Cronin say in this theory, that there's always much more to stories told that could either enrich or alter their meaning. And so as a communication theorist, I was interested potentially in pursuing the enriched or altered meaning from this start of a reuniting of potential friendship. And so instead of saying, hey, I'm dropping you as my Facebook friend, I wrote back and I just said, memories. Wow, I guess winners remember and losers forget. I don't recall racking up a backlog of 17 dozen donuts. But I know I bet donuts. I do remember that. I do remember that I probably lost some bets to Harold, and perhaps I owed him some donuts. I certainly didn't remember owing him 17 dozen. But that's how I decided to respond to this particular comment that Harold made. Now, then I waited for Harold to respond. And how is he going to respond? Now, this an acronym here is probably one of the strangest acronyms that you will encounter in any communication theory, and for that reason I think it's memorable. It's a very weird system here, but you'll not forget it because you just pronounce it as loot, loot. And it's very strange, but each letter here stands for an important idea in the process of coordinating meaning. And so the first letter, L, indicates lived stories, what we actually did or are doing. Now, in this particular story, Harold had a claim of what we actually did or were doing 40 years ago. We were betting donuts, and I received this claim, and the claim sounded fairly reasonable to me given our particular history. I didn't remember the details of 17 dozen donuts, but it certainly sounded reasonable that I had bet donuts, and maybe after we had parted, I still owed him some donuts. The first U in the LOOT abbreviation stands for unknown stories, or information that is missing. Now, Harold's claim implied that I had deliberately avoided paying my bets, or at least that's one way I could have interpreted it. You owe me 17 dozen donuts. My reaction to that was not so, but I was not sure what exactly had happened. There was an unknown story here, as far as I was concerned, that I had to deal with in working out this meaning with Harold about this particular incident. I certainly knew that, at least I didn't believe that I had deliberately avoided paying my bets, but I wasn't sure what exactly had happened. It was an unknown story. I didn't know whether I left Highland Park, New Jersey to college owing Harold 17 dozen donuts or not. The next U in LOOT is untold stories, what we chose not to say. Now, when Harold contacted me, he did not elaborate on his memory of the bets. And this made me a little bit suspicious. In other words, he didn't say, hey, Sparks, we bet on the Baltimore Bullets New York Knicks, or we bet on the New York Yankees Baltimore Orioles, and do you remember this particular bet? You told me you were going to pay me 5 dozen donuts if you lost, and you didn't do that. There were some untold stories here. He didn't elaborate on the nature of those bets, and I also had some untold stories in that I did not refute his claim. I didn't tell him, no, I don't owe you 17 dozen donuts, and here's how I know that. So there were some untold stories that were in the mix of this coordinated management of meaning. I did not refute his claim, even though I didn't remember owing him 17 dozen donuts. So there were some untold stories that were in the mix here. There were also, the next U, there were also some untellable stories. Stories that are forbidden or too painful for us to tell. And one of those stories is this. If I had bet donuts with Harold, my parents would hardly have approved of it. And it would have been very difficult for me to make public to my parents and to my family that I owed Harold 17 dozen donuts. That would have been a very difficult story for me to tell at the time to my family. My parents would have certainly never permitted that to take place because you don't bet the profits, as my dad was fond of saying, and you don't give the profits away. So there was an untellable story here. It would have been too painful for me to actually admit that I did this if I had done it. The first of the last two T's in LOOT, storytelling, the manner in which we communicate. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I could have interpreted Harold's comment as an angry accusation, but I decided not to do that because this was, after all, a Facebook forum, and I knew that one of the things about Facebook was that it offered the potential to reconnect to old friends. I had never really experienced that before, and so this was one of my first opportunities to do that. And so I decided to take this comment as more like an attempt for Harold to reconnect with me, even though on the face of it, I could have interpreted that comment in a very different way. So the manner in which we communicate is very important in the stories that we are telling. Well, The second T, what we say we are doing. And what I decided to do was to transform this conversation into a new bet. I decided to coordinate the meaning of this interaction and take it one step further. As it turned out, at the time that we connected in 2012, the Orioles and the Yankees were in a pennant race in the American League East. And I was somewhat confident that perhaps the Orioles were going to beat out the Yankees in the American League East division race in this particular year. And so I made a bold proposal that Harold took me up on. I said, Harold, why don't we go double or nothing on the 17 dozen donuts? If the Orioles win the division over the Yankees this year, then I owe you nothing. If they lose, then I will owe you double the 17 dozen donuts. I'll owe you 34 dozen donuts. I decided to tell a different kind of story and make something different out of what we were doing here. Rather than negotiating an old bet, let's turn it into something new. And I was actually guided by the values in the coordinated management of meaning theory in doing that in order to enrich the meaning of this particular interaction. Well, what happened? This is the final standings in 2012. As you see, the New York Yankees beat out the Baltimore Orioles by 2 games in the standings, and so I lost the double or nothing wager, and now I am down not 17 dozen donuts, I'm down 34 dozen donuts. One of the ideas in the coordinated management of theory is we get what we make. Very important idea. We get what we make. And some of the questions here that get answered: how did that get made? What are we making? And most importantly, what can we do to make better social worlds? This is a very important value that comes through, especially in Barnett Pierce's work in the Peace Center. What can we do to make better social worlds? Notice that this is a very clear value statement. This is not characteristic of objective theory, that we're trying to make better social worlds. This is much more characteristic of interpretive theory that's infused by a particular value to improve our social environment in some particular way. And so this was a question that I definitely had in my mind as I was coordinating the meaning in this particular interaction. Well, I certainly got what I made. I lost the bet, and I now owed Harold 34 dozen donuts. I deliberately made that wager. I decided to step out on a limb and make some new meaning here, take a risk, and I lost the bet, and now I owed him 34 dozen donuts. Well, what are we making exactly? What are we making? I hoped I was going to make something better out of this, but I was a little bit challenged to do that since I was now down 34 dozen donuts. Well, get the pattern right. The coordinated management of meaning theory says get the pattern right, create better outcomes. And one of the key questions here, after answering how did that get made, well, I knew how it got made. I made a foolish wager to go double or nothing on 17 dozen donuts. I knew what we were making when I did that. But the third question here, what can we do to make better social worlds? And that's the question that I was challenged with. Now that I owed Harold 34 dozen donuts, how was I going to make a better social world out of this? How was I going to take this Facebook connection with an old friend and make something good out of it? And so I had to sit down one evening and ponder that. And I knew that Harold lived in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. I did not know anyone in particular in Fort Lauderdale, but this was a sports bet. And so I got an idea. I decided to call up the Fort Lauderdale newspaper and look for sports journalists who worked at that paper and find their pictures. And I decided, simply on the basis of a blind photograph, I located a guy named Mike Berardino. Now, if you want to look Mike up, I believe he now works up in Minnesota. I think he has moved from Florida, but he still has an online presence as a sports journalist. And I decided, based on Mike's picture, I just looked at his picture, and I decided, hey, you know what? I think this guy might be up for some fun. And so I emailed him. I emailed Mike Berardino one evening, and I told him what had happened. I told him that I had connected with an old friend on Facebook from 40 years ago. He was a Yankees fan. I was an Orioles fan. I told him about my parents owning a donut shop, and that this guy said I owed him 17 dozen donuts. I told him about the wager that we had made, that I was now down 34 dozen donuts. And I said, here's what I would like to do, Mike. I would like to have 34 dozen donuts delivered to Harold one Saturday morning from me. But I don't know anybody in Fort Lauderdale, and I just wondered whether you, as a sports journalist, might be interested in writing up this story. And you can interview me, and I'll tell you any of the details. It might be an interesting story for your readership. And if you would be involved in delivering these donuts to Harold, that would really be splendid. Well, this guy, he wrote back almost immediately. I picked the right journalist. How I recognize this guy's face as somebody who might go along with this, I don't know. But I picked the right guy. He wrote back within a half an hour, and he said, this is the greatest thing I have dealt with in my journalist career in a long time. And he said, I'll be happy to go to the Dunkin' Donut shop and pick up the 34 dozen donuts this Saturday morning with my daughter, and we will make the delivery. Now, you can figure it out. This was not going to be cheap for me. The donuts, I believe, were, I tried to get a discounted price, but I was not successful. I think they were about $4.99 or $5.99 a dozen, and I had to get 34 dozen. And so I called the donut shop, and I made the order. And Mike and his daughter showed up there on Saturday morning, picked up the donuts, and made the delivery. I didn't even know if Harold was going to be there, but it turned out that he was. And we created a right pattern. We created better outcomes. This Facebook contact was transformed into a national news story, and Doug can actually show you that. There's a little video here. It actually went local. So if you're familiar with Dave McAnally at WTHR in Indianapolis, Dave and I have worked together on several stories, and when this story went national, Dave McAnally decided to come up and do a little video piece on it, and so Doug can play that video piece for you right now. This was featured on NBC News in Indianapolis at the time, back in 2012, and so you get to see how the whole story unfolded. So Doug, you can play that right now. And finally, hope you enjoyed that. Finally, here's another thing that we took out of this, and I think this is still true. If you Google the phrase 34 dozen donuts, this is the story that's going to come up, and you can read about all the details of this little episode in my life. And so I was able to use, in this case, the coordinated management of meaning theory to make a better social world. Harold and I are now in contact on Facebook. It turns out his political leanings are quite different than mine, but we are connected in a way that we were not, and it didn't have to end this way. There were choices to be made. There was meaning to be coordinated. Go back to the beginning and note that slide again. This first comment was a comment that I could have taken umbrage with. I could have reacted with some hostility to. What are you talking about? I don't know you 17 dozen donuts. The story could have gone a very different way. And so in this theory, you're encouraged to think about how can you make a better social world? How can you coordinate meaning through storytelling that makes something good? And this is a particular episode that I'm very glad that I decided to react the way that I did, rather than to react with hostility and drop Harold as my Facebook friend. This turned out to be a much better option, and this is the kind of thing that Barnett Pierce and Cronin have tried to do and emphasize in this particular theoretical perspective. So hope you enjoyed this story, and I think it does illustrate some of the important principles in the coordinated management of meaning theory. Have a good weekend, and let's hope that Purdue football comes out better this Saturday than we did this last Sunday. And I hope to be back with you at some point. I'm not sure exactly when I'll be back with you in person, but certainly hope to, at some point in the near future, actually make an appearance in the classroom so you can meet me and I can meet you. I'm very much looking forward to that. Bye for now, and have a great weekend, and a good recitation meeting this week.